Hi, good morning.
Well, it's handling it better than I.
All right, we're in. Thank you, Roxana. Can you hear us?
Good.
Yes, thank you. I just needed Steve to stand here with the IT magic. And it worked.
Oh, yeah, that's the magic he has.
Thank you.
You all set? Do you want me to close this?
I think we're good. I don't know if anyone else is, well, you can leave it open because Big N is getting coffee. Thank you.
I'm ready for my close-up.
And you're looking good. We had on mute. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, good.
Okay. Great.
I was thinking of, what was that movie? Sunset Boulevard.
Oh,
At the end of the movie, you know, the actress comes downstairs and she says, "I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille." You got to watch it sometime.
Well, the good news, like when we have meetings and there's only one person on the other end, they're like the giant.
Yeah.
Not
Giant
too bad
talking
this
head.
way. Yeah.
A giant talking head, right?
Right, it's like we have-
good. We have people joining.
Thank you everyone for signing in. We'll get started in just a moment. We can see attendees are joining. Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it another minute or two. We can see the attendees coming in. So thank you for joining us in the virtual world, and also we have Justin here virtually or in real life too. So thank you. Just please bear with us one more minute. We have had some folks that joined us through the Teams link, so I need to send them a message. Oh, someone is already doing that. Thank you.
I got just.
Right, well, again, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. We'll do a quick round of introductions on this side. We have about 20 attendees in the webinar. So we'll just introduce ourselves and our project team, and we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Amanda Fagan, and I'm the Director of Planning and Sustainability here at the Ventura County Transportation Commission. We here at VCTC have partnered with the Ventura Council of Governments, VCOG, to develop this vehicle miles traveled adaptive mitigation program. So thank you for joining us for this workshop, and I'll turn the floor over to my fellow teammates here to introduce themselves, and we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks again for joining us.
Hey, I'm Sean Daly from iTerrace. I'm the consultant team project manager. I'll be the second of our presenters today. The third is Jesse. He's joining us virtually, so I think he'll introduce himself in the virtual group, but turn it over to Vigan.
My name is Vigan Davidian. I'm also with iTerrace, and I'm principally in charge with the project. And I do everything that Sean tells me to do.
That's nice.
Drew Kent here, VCTC Planning Analyst.
Justin, do you want to just say hi?
Justin
Justin is our
Link, City of Simi Valley. I'm not part of the project team and apparently the only brave one to show up today, even though a lot of you are supposed to be here for TTAC this afternoon.
All right, well, then our teammates on in the virtual world, Jesse.
Hi, yeah, I'm Jesse Warrenberg, an environmental planner with Rincon Consultants. Also here with my colleague Richard Dalton, who's a principal at Rincon, and we've been helping out on the CEQA side of things for the program.
And Chris.
Yes, hi, Chris Williamson here, representing VCOG. So thank you for doing this, of course.
Chris. All right, Sean, we'll go ahead.
So we get started.
Share the screen.
There it is.
All right, well, again, thank you for joining us. We will be providing an overview and really when we get to the point where we really want to hear your feedback on this draft program here for the Vehicle Miles Traveled Adaptive Mitigation Program for CEQA streamlining. That's really the intent of the program. So this effort has been funded by a grant from the State Department of Housing and Community Development through the Regional Early Action Planning, or REAP program, with support from the Southern California Association of Governments. The program is managed overall by the Ventura Council of Governments in partnership with the Ventura County Transportation Commission. We have a consultant team that's supporting us through this effort. The prime consultant is Iteris, and Rincon and DTA are the subs on this project. So we'll spend a little bit of time first going over the program sort of background and general parameters. We'll talk about CEQA streamlining, roles and recommendations for the adaptive mitigation program, efforts to identify VMT impacts and really try to develop a proactive methodology for doing so, and then looking forward and next steps in the program. So within the first section of the workshop focused on an introduction to the adaptive mitigation program, key points include the connection between transportation, land use, and housing development, an introduction to the new CEQA transportation metric of vehicle miles traveled, and support for statewide goals related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, while also meeting local needs related to housing. So to begin, I'll set the stage with a bit of data on transportation in Ventura County and the relationship between housing and transportation. With a population of around 850,000, Ventura County has around 625,000 licensed drivers and over 770,000 registered vehicles. Over 2 million daily trips occur within our county, resulting in over 17 million vehicle miles traveled, or VMT daily. This figure shows the origins and destinations of trips in Ventura County, with around 88% of trips originating and ending within the county or internal trips, and only about 12% of trips external to the county. And those 12% of trips, however, account for approximately 42% of VMT. In part because of the countywide adoption of the guidelines for orderly development in the late 1970s, here in Ventura County, we have distinct cities that are separated by open space and agriculture. Of course, the exception is Port Hueneme, which is surrounded by Oxnard. This development pattern, reinforced by public SOAR votes and general plans, tends to raise VMT for intercity travel, but is intended to create more compact cities, ideally with lower VMT travel and more multimodal options within cities. The vast majority of commute trips in Ventura County occur by driving alone, though this proportion of trips declined by about 10% between 2019 and 2021. This is largely due to an increase in the share of Ventura County commuters who worked from home having tripled. During that same time period, the share of commute trips using public transportation declined by half. And as we plan for the future of housing and transportation in Ventura County, we consider population projections and changing demographics. The most recent population projections for Ventura County reflect a decline in population by 2050, but a substantial increase of about 13% in the number of households. This may seem counterintuitive, but average household size is going down and may also reflect growth in the second home market. In other words, we will need more housing to meet the needs of our communities and market demand, despite a relatively stable population. Projections also indicate that employment in Ventura County will remain relatively stable by 2050. At the same time, Ventura County will see shifting demographics, reflecting an aging population. In 2020, approximately 11% of the population of Ventura County was over 70 years of age. But by 2040, the percentage of the population over age 70 will nearly double to 21%. It's remarkable that 1 in 5 Ventura County residents will be over age 70. This is in some ways good news for transportation planning, with older adults in general having a smaller average daily vehicle miles traveled. However, it requires a rethinking of our housing supply and transportation system to better serve an aging population that is not likely able to depend on driving to get around. And with stable employment projections combined with the doubling of our retirement age population, without careful planning and production of housing to meet the changing needs, Ventura County may see increased travel into the county from employees who live outside of the county with longer commute distances. It probably goes without saying that there is an intricate relationship between transportation and housing. Locating higher density housing near income matched jobs and with access to multimodal transportation options is the most effective way to address the negative environmental impacts of transportation, including reducing VMT and greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation. In that same vein, multimodal transportation infrastructure and service can support housing production and lead to more livable, sustainable communities. So recognizing that connection between housing and transportation, the California State Legislature passed and the governor signed SB 743 in 2013 with the intent to more appropriately balance the needs of congestion management with statewide goals related to infill development, promotion of public health through active transportation, and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. When implemented, traffic congestion shall not be considered a significant impact on the environment within the California Environmental Quality Act transportation analysis. As the Regional Transportation Planning Agency serving Ventura County, VCTC has worked to assist cities and the county to comply with SB 743 and shift from evaluating transportation impacts on the environment based on level of service or vehicle congestion to instead considering VMT. The intent of this change is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, develop multimodal transportation networks, and foster a diversity of land uses. And so before I turn the floor over to Sean for the remainder of the presentation, I just want to ask for our record keeping purposes, if you could in the chat, share your name and affiliation so that we can get a better sense of who's here with us in the virtual room. So, Sean?
Great. Thank you for that and setting that stage. I'm going to talk for a bit about VMT as a metric of analysis and a CEQA metric because it is altogether confusing, especially when we have 17 million VMT per day. It becomes a little bit mind-boggling. So the Office of Planning and Research, the state office, when they were putting together the parts of the CEQA guidelines that were revised to implement this, really landed on vehicle miles traveled as indexed or divided by or normalized by people, so per capita, as the most appropriate metric because it's sort of cut across all these lines of their goals. And so, and I'll show why. So it's really about the type of travel. It's not the amount of travel. VMT on its own is the amount of travel, but when you index it per capita, it suddenly becomes about how you're traveling. So in our top example there, we just have a one person traveling 10 miles per day from a project site. So that's 10 VMT per day. Another project, if it were 3 people, that would be 30 total VMT per day, but still just that 10 VMT per capita per day. And the idea is you could take those 3 people, and if you shifted them to other modes of travel, you're just doing that 10 vehicle miles per day with 3 times as many people. So it's a third of the VMT per capita. And so that's sort of the idea, is that moving people closer to jobs, and providing more transportation options really get us towards not only greenhouse gas benefits, but other co-benefits of, ultimately reduce congestion, which is interesting because that's not environmental impact anymore, but it's something that is addressed in a large way by this. So VMT as a CEQA metric. In general, as I said, the auto mileage VMT is driven down by shorter trips and trips made without vehicles. That part of it's fairly simple. Once you get to VMT as a metric that's indexed by population, it gets a little bit more complicated. vehicle miles traveled have always really been around as a metric of transportation. It's usually like an area-wide value. Once you index it to population, you get into things like, well, which subset of population are we talking about? And we're not talking about necessarily on the regional scale. When you get down to a project level, it gets a little complicated because you're not necessarily going to be following people around and recording their individual VMT, even though that's a real life, phenomena. So it does cause some challenges. In terms of the recommended threshold of significance, the state did recommend 15% below baseline, and that was tagged to meeting greenhouse gas reduction goals. However, really the thresholds are ultimately set by CEQA lead agencies, and that determines the sensitivity of vehicle mile traveled impact. And the reason it's set by lead agencies like other thresholds is there are lots of local conditions, and there's even differences among different projects that may be taken into account. So there's some implications here about switching your CEQA metric. So there's no more traffic analysis that is directly tied to CEQA impact and also mitigation. We'd had a fairly mature, I guess, impact and mitigation based on traffic congestion for many, many, many decades in the state. So a lot of people are very used to that, and they're very used to approaching how projects create impacts is, oh, it raises traffic, and what are you going to do about that? So that's been a hard transition for a lot of lead agencies. A lot of jurisdictions are still requiring traffic analysis, not really as CEQA significance determination, but really as informational to the public to provide an idea of that broader purpose of CEQA, which is just to provide information about projects. Really the concern about a new metric is, oh gee, is this going to take additional cost and time for projects? So it might, and that's exactly what this program is trying to address and trying in the streamlining to reduce costs and time due to this. The concept of the entire program was to actually in itself use this metric to streamline projects. It is very hard to do infill development and not have traffic impacts. And so that was viewed as a barrier to development, making it, there's all these reasons why greenfield development is easier in a lot of ways. And so, eliminating one of those sort of regulatory challenges to infill development was a core intent here. So overall, this adaptive mitigation program is really trying to assist in making sure that all those concerns about additional cost and time at least are addressed in some level, and there's some support for the lead agencies. So we're listing sort of four major parts of the program here. One, the program consolidates and refines VMT data from VCTC's travel demand model, which provides the VMT data. As I mentioned, in theory, one could directly measure VMT by following people around or tracking them. That's costly and there's a lot of privacy concerns. So we do model that for existing conditions. And then of course we model for future conditions, which you couldn't get by following people around. So that's the primary tool. It's based on a long-standing travel demand model that's been developed and calibrated using many, many different data sources. So there's a high degree of confidence. It's probably, travel demand models are probably the best tool for VMT, especially at this point. Second, this adaptive program provides a standard methodology for the assessment of project level VMT. It's not really a required methodology that would be imposed on lead agencies, but it provides an option for lead agencies to use as well, and applicants, either as their, the VMT methodology they're using to determine impacts, or just a backcheck analysis. Hopefully it's simple enough that it at the very least could be used as a secondary look at VMT. Because as we were saying, it's very large numbers. It's a new way of looking at things. I think most people don't have a good feel for what, a good or bad VMT outcome really is. The third thing is mitigation, broadly listed under VMT reduction strategies. These could be used as project elements to reduce VMT or mitigation, including a mechanism for a fair share cost contribution as mitigation. That was a common practice for transportation mitigations when we were basing it off traffic congestion. That relied on sort of direct impact to a facility from a project. When you're looking at VMT, that fair share calculation is actually based on the cost of reducing VMT, and then using those fair share funds to contribute towards projects that do actually reduce VMT. Just to note, we did explore the possibility of a countywide fee or mitigation program as part of this. It, for many reasons, logistically and legal, is very difficult. There's a lot of required capacity and legal hoops. And in general, VCOG and VCTC are not themselves CEQA lead agencies. So it's really, they would be doing that as a service to the other lead agencies. I think it's something in the future that can be explored, but really the recommendation is for the individual lead agencies to develop sort of a roster of mitigation options for applicants, as opposed to one unified regional or county-wide program. And lastly, this program is going to be adopted by VCTC, or the report at least is going to be adopted by VCTC. So it does provide some important credibility as CEQA substantial evidence as agencies move forward in analysis, or applicants as well, I should say. Okay, so a little bit more about that CEQA mitigation. I think the biggest concern about this new VMT metric is that there just won't be adequate feasible mitigations to reduce an impact. And so you'd have to carry a project all the way through an EIR and potentially through a statement of overriding consideration. And it's certainly maybe true. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, of some projects that are just very big and complicated. But at least we want to minimize the potential of that just because of transportation. Listing out potential on-site and off-site VMT reduction measures is an important step for applicants to look at early on, a look-see at what their VMT potential is. So they could potentially include some VMT reduction measures in their proposed project, and whether it's their site plan or some program. And so you're sort of taking care of that situation before mitigation is needed and carried through a CEQA analysis, which would avoid the significant impact determination, sort of allow for more mitigated negative declarations as opposed to EIRs and that sort of thing. There are various levels of VMT reduction strategies here. We're sort of showing increasing scale, maybe difficulty, probably cost, where you're going from on-site to sort of area, like improving bus stops nearby, to working with lead agencies for bigger projects. And then sort of the biggest thing would be contributing to a very large multi-jurisdictional transportation project. As Amanda said, when you've got 12% of the people creating 40% of the VMT, it sure looks like something like investing in the Metrolink stations is a really good bang for your buck in terms of reducing VMT. So that would be sort of that case. So one of the data sources, taking from the model and some other items here, this is really the look at residential VMT in Ventura County. And so the darkest green areas are the transit areas. Those are, under most circumstances, a project would be presumed to be less than significant. They're areas which provide the most alternatives to automobiles, and therefore are most easily recommended for future housing development based on that. The lighter green areas are those areas that are 15% below that average baseline for a community. They currently have lower VMT than other parts of the county, and they generally are your downtown and inner neighborhoods of cities. And they would probably be areas that are less significant. The blue areas are areas of high employment, but they have little or no housing. So they don't meet that 15% below baseline threshold, but it's fairly likely that if you put housing there, because of the jobs housing balance, that if you really did a true analysis of it, they would, show benefit and likely would also have, less of a chance of being significant. And then the orange areas are those areas with the 15%, higher than the 15% below baseline. Housing development in these areas would likely need some VMT reducing project elements or mitigation to be brought down to less significant. And of course, the gray areas are protected land. And in those, the scale of development is probably going to be below most agencies' threshold for even a project size to undergo a SEQA analysis, such as like one single family home. This next shows the housing element level of allocation. So really the interesting takeaway, and maybe it's not perfectly visual in this, is that about 30% are in those transit areas of RENA housing allocation in the latest housing elements. But about 2/3 are in areas that are less than 15% of the below the county VMT average. So put those together and you've got about 71% are in meeting either of those criteria. So a little more than 70% of the housing allocation are already in areas that are low VMT. So in a sense, the cities and the county, the way they're allocating housing is very supportive of this goal in general. So that's very positive. So just to reiterate, the purpose of this program through this grant is it is housing focused. I think early on when we interacted with the lead agencies, the cities and the county in this program, we were asked to sort of expand it beyond housing. It's certainly not, the intent is housing, but all of these principles can be applied to any type of development. So whereas it is housing focused, and you're going to keep hearing that, and that's the information we're using, the principles of how you do VMT analysis, the information provided by VCTC goes beyond housing. It includes employment and so it can be applied for all sorts of SEQA projects. So overall, it's really about working with the lead agencies and getting those tools that help them assess VMT, find strategies to lower VMT, and that includes that mechanism for mitigation and then standards for mitigation monitoring. We have some live resources that you can look at. We also have coming soon. So after this meeting, probably in the next week or two, we're going to start posting things under the specific AMP website that's collecting these standards. I think first thing first, we'll put up the draft report for everyone to use, to peruse as well. And then we want to have sort of a landing page for lead agency information about their thresholds and contact information. That's really for applicants to support them. So yeah, so I guess we're gonna open it up for any questions at this point. I think we can, if you can type in the Q&A, I don't know, unless we unmute everyone. We can give you a minute, and while you're thinking, if you have any questions, I can just again go over those key points, which really are, that we have this new transportation metric, and it's really about supporting those state goals, but more importantly, streamlining for each of the applicants and the lead agencies to ensure that you meet those goals in a straightforward way that isn't, put you down that difficult, years-long track and cost time and money, but to really help everyone out in that analysis.
So we do have a question in the Q&A from Kathy about not being able to see who's attending or whether you're muted. I think it's because we set the webinar up today through Zoom as a webinar. So I can share that we have 24 participants in the room. I think some of you have included your name and affiliation in the chat. And again, we really appreciate that, just so we can help keep track of who's here. But everyone should be muted on the other the non-presenters. And if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, or you can put a chat in and we can enable you to talk.
I guess I can't be muted.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I mean,
What happens when you show up in person?
and even if you have questions sort of after the fact, I'm great at coming up with interesting questions a day later or something like that. I mean, we're certainly always available to answer questions. I think primarily we want to have the draft report, and if anyone has any comments on that, we do have an executive summary, so it's it should be not too big of a haul, but we do want to get feedback on that. I think the most important feedback is, what can we do to make the whole process easier on you? That real streamlining. What are the tools you want to see, and the things you want standardized in a way or made clear.
And I can see there's a question from Kathleen. Can you explain the slide titled Ventura County GP housing elements and the purple slices or RENA allocation on the map? The slice of purple on this map is not truly the city's RENA allocation. You explain that?
Yeah, that may be true. Sorry about that. So I actually went through the housing elements, and we allocated them to parcels. They might not be perfect. We were doing general areas, and it was sort of operating at different levels. So I will double check that for you. And it may graphically come out a little odd because the size of the parcel it made it look like some things were bigger than other things, but
Model parcel based or TAZ?
so we did the reallocation on the parcel level, but then aggregated it to TAZs. So it's sort of like, in a way, we didn't have to be perfect about it because it aggregated to a bigger geography. Yeah, so I will definitely, though, double check that. We'll look into that. And the other thing is, for that one too, we sort of based it off of county VMT, not average VMT, not at the city level, lead agency level. So there are a couple of things we sort of did as like a planning level, getting an idea of where things were, but they weren't intended to necessarily be truly used as tools.
Do you have any other questions or comments at this point? Otherwise, we can keep going. Oh, yes, just.
So the one thing that I think so far, and what the original intent of SB 743 was, that really we were trying to do our best to screen every single project out. So thus far, after a couple of years of doing this, maybe a couple of years, I've managed to get mostly everything screened, and what I have analyzed, model that Iteris put together for us, managed to be below the threshold, with the exception of maybe one project. But so the one thing that I haven't anticipated or even come across yet is mitigation monitoring. And I know that, that there's hopefully going to be some tools with regard to that, but what have other cities done as far as that? Because a lot of these tools that we have that have been suggested by OPR for mitigation are things that we can't necessarily monitor, like
They're
transit
really
passes,
yeah.
or, I mean, I can count the number of bicycle racks that are being required of a project, but I can't determine whether the apartment complex is pricing parking the way that they had agreed to. So is there any examples?
I think most communities are in that same boat where they're trying to screen out, because honestly, most of the development is, multifamily and infill. And so a lot of it does screen out from an analysis. Those mitigation monitoring programs, what I've heard about, as those get developed, they are more like sort of infrastructure based, like you shall build this thing.
Right.
And we're going to infer that it's going to have a VMT reduction value associated with it, much like we did before with the traffic operation. You shall add a right turn signal. They're not going back and totally ensuring that, even though pretty much in a way, cities did that periodically monitored. I think we're globally, we have continually monitoring VMT. And so in a global sense, yes, as part of that continuum as either cities or a county, we'll see how that goes. But there's, of course, many other factors. You have population growing and all that kind of thing. But yeah, most of them are that infrastructure based. Like you've met your mitigation if you've done this thing that we have said will reduce the VMT less than significant.
The problem is half of the infrastructure things that I can require don't necessarily reduce VMT. Everything infrastructure related is generally
Yeah. Some of it's
demand or something else like that. So
yeah. And it does complicate things. So in a way, this severed the CEQA mitigation from a lot of other mitigations that the cities may require. So it's sort of weird. You may still require traffic operations mitigations as part of conformance with the general plan and that sort of thing. And so it does complicate things a little bit. And they may be a little bit counter to each other in a way. Hopefully not. For the most part, those multimodal investments don't have the same interaction, with operations as much an interaction as we've seen. But
Yeah, typically the most effective VMT reduction measures are more regional and implemented by agencies, typically transit types of.
where this comes into play.
yeah, and the interesting thing about VMT mitigation as well is it doesn't have to be that project's VMT. You could be mitigating broadly VMT from a different source. So it's sort of always been true in a bizarre way about the traffic operations ones as well. But yeah, I think that was the allure of a singular regional program that you pay into to reduce VMT. The logistics sort of ran afoul of that, but I think there's still an opportunity there if there's a big enough project that really has to mitigate VMT that they could participate into a bigger regional program.
So Kathleen has another question also on that green allocation slide. How does the work take into consideration the high quality transit corridor through Oxnard, which will be achieved in 2028, or will this be covered later in the presentation or through the data?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm asking for a follow-up. I'll just sort of infer what, so the high quality transit area is a future high quality transit that, so right now, Gold Coast Transit isn't operating buses at a frequency at a level that is technically currently meets that threshold, but we are planning long-term. So the guidance from the state is if you're planned to have a high quality transit corridor, we can plan for housing development and implement housing development in support of that planned route. So I think, it is tough. All these things, the timelines for housing development, the timelines for transit operations and infrastructure, they don't fully meet up. But as we plan for them together through the environmental analysis, the idea is that they'll both, be in place in a more permanent situation in the future.
And then as you're developing additional housing within those corridors, you're also supporting the transit to be realized. It's that relationship between the housing and transportation. So another question from Mark regarding mitigation monitoring. It is my impression that at least some agencies that require mitigation programs, such as carpooling, only check to confirm that the program was implemented, not for effectiveness, and that monitoring is only done for a few days.
Years.
A few years, sorry.
Yeah, and I think that sort of falls under that same thing that, as a county, everyone's sort of working together and sort of monitoring the effectiveness broadly of these programs. In the future, if we need to, have more effective mitigations, we shall do that. But we're sort of relying with our best information on those mitigation monitoring programs.
On a mitigation monitoring, if I remember correctly, I think Caltrans has a program or some kind of a pilot program to try to like come back every 5 years or something like that and actually do surveys and do counts to actually try to estimate that. I'm not sure how practical that is, but I think they were trying to do something along those lines.
Right, and I wouldn't think that it wouldn't be available if they wanted to, a lead agency working with a project applicant to actually monitor the effectiveness. So like, say transit passes, how many are actually used, that kind of thing. I mean, that's perfectly, within their authority to do that. So a lead agency could follow that. We just find that there's a lot of capacity issues and just the time to deal with that. I mean, it's sort of you allocate resources where you can. It's just very tough.
I mean, a lot of this is just on an honor system, I guess.
Right. I mean, I could put all kinds of conditions with all kinds of teeth in them. It's just whether somebody at either environmental services or somewhere else is going to follow up on that.
And the lead agency invariably is the local jurisdiction. So, I mean, local jurisdictions are, it's up to them, really. I mean, they're free to develop any kind of mitigation monitoring program, whether it's, a spreadsheet program or it's an online program or whatever, but it requires staff. It requires staff and follow through. So, I mean, for consistency basis, I think there's some merit probably to have a regional agency maybe suggest some sort of a unified program that all the local agencies would implement, or if a local agency already has something, maybe they share with others. And but I think, as I said, these are pretty much on an honor system.
Self-reporting.
Yeah.
There's
Even
some,
having somebody fill out a Google sheet that reports back what they've done.
yeah.
And then if they don't, you hit them with a fine.
So we have another comment from Tom that Victoria Avenue south of Telephone has 15-minute headways right now. And that's a good point, that there are areas within our transit service, particularly when you look at combined service across different agencies that do meet that definition. The Route 6 is a good example that through Oxnard and Ventura, where there's a combined VCTC intercity service and Gold Coast service that at least come close to meeting that headway already.
Yeah, and I think, oh, there we
And then
go.
we had another comment from Dan, I think. The city of Agora Hills is requiring driveway monitoring to show vehicle trip reduction as part of TDM plans.
Yes, I'm sorry. That was something I thought of really quickly and then I quickly forgot when you'd asked. But I think a lot of people are mostly requiring mitigation that is TDM based from, air quality requirements, and then piggybacking that on for the VMT mitigation, which is a good idea because we have that foundation and they do meet, a lot of the same goals. So yeah, thank you for that.
So trip reduction based on what they anticipate the average trip generation would have been, and then
Exactly. Yeah. Generally speaking. Yep.
Well, we wouldn't give you the distance, but it would give you.
Yeah, it gives you trips. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go on to the next section.
Yeah, so we're passing it over to Jesse here. He's going to tell us exactly. We were totally wrong just now. In all of our answers. But yeah, take it away, Jesse. And I'm operating the slides. So.
Cool.
What do you mean?
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Amanda. I won't. Not too many things that you guys got wrong. So for those of you who weren't on for the introductions, I'm Jesse Vorenberg. I'm an environmental planner at Rincon Consultants. Also here with Richard Dalton, who's a principal at Rincon. So our focus today is going to be on CEQA streamlining. We're going to hone in on housing specifically, since the Adaptive Mitigation Program, or I'll refer to as the AMP, is funded through that Regional Early Action Planning Grant that Sean and Amanda talked about, that's focused on housing. But everything I'm going to talk about is applicable to any CEQA projects. Go to the next slide. So before I get started, just want to talk about a few keys to keep in mind throughout my presentation. So as Sean and Amanda use the word streamlining a little bit, I'll continue to use that a lot, but I want to be clear about the two types of streamlining. There's big S streamlining, and that refers to tiering off of a previously certified CEQA document. And then there's the little s streamlining, which is what the AMP facilitates by allowing for preemptive mitigation for VMT, which could otherwise slow CEQA documentation. I'll be discussing both, but just keep in mind that the AMP is that little s streamlining. And then before considering streamlining for housing projects using the AMP, it's first good to determine if maybe the project has some sort of other exemption from CEQA. So I'll discuss that in a bit as well. And then if the project is not exempt and may have a significant and unavoidable VMT impact, the AMP presents a good opportunity for a little s streamlined project process. The next slide. So as probably most of you already know, but I'll just review, CEQA applies to several types of projects, largely those that have not previously been planned for. So for example, discretionary activities that are proposed by a California public agency or private projects that require approval from a public agency require CEQA analysis. Other public projects that do not meet exemption criteria require CEQA analysis, such as general plans, specific plans, or roadway projects. Additionally, CEQA compliance is broadly required for any project that could significantly affect the environment. Next slide. So there are a few types of CEQA documents, each of which is prepared based on the nature of the project pending CEQA approval. There is notice of exemption, or NOE, negative declaration, an ND, a mitigated negative declaration, an MND, an environmental impact report, an EIR, or addendums to previously certified EIRs or MNDs. Notice of exemptions are available through categorical and statutory exemptions, which I'll discuss later, and present the shortest form of CEQA documentation and process. I'll also discuss later how MNDs present the small s streamlining opportunity with implementation of the AMP. Again, just some review. CEQA lead agencies are responsible for deciding which type of CEQA documentation is required. Lead agencies are public agencies that carry out or approve a project subject to CEQA, including discretionary privately funded projects. Lead agencies are cities, counties, council of governments, and state agencies. So before jumping into the CEQA process, it's important to first check to see if your project may be exempt from CEQA. Exemptions can be granted in three ways: by statute, categorically, or through the common sense exemption. Statutory exemptions apply almost regardless of environmental impacts and include things like ministerial projects and emergency projects. Categorical exemptions, which also we'll discuss a little bit more later, include 32 classes and must meet a series of conditions before being considered. The common sense exemption is used when there isn't a possibility that the project would cause an impact on the environment. Then there's the two types of streamlining. As I've already mentioned, the first type, small s streamlining, avoids preparation of an EIR through preemptive and adaptive mitigation, like is made possible through the AMP for VMT impacts. This allows for preparation of an MND instead of a full-blown EIR when VMT may be your only significant and unavoidable impact. Won't get into big S streamlining too much, but in short, it allows for a formal tiering off of a previously certified CEQA document, such as a general plan or specific plan. And as I'll discuss a little bit later, there's also space for the AMP in that process. It's a bit of a longer process than a regular exemption, but still speeds up CEQA process when an MND or EIR may otherwise be required. So yes, there are some great reasons to both little s and big S streamline and also exempt, which mostly come down to shrinking the size and time required to prepare the CEQA document. For our context, a little less streamlining using the AMP is useful when a lead agency anticipates VMT to be the only potentially significant impact for a project. As I've touched on a little bit, and Sean talked about, flexible and adaptive mitigation programs like the VMT AMP can facilitate little less streamlining for projects that have that significant and unavoidable VMT impact. This wouldn't permit preparation of a notice of exemption, but could allow for preparation of an MND instead of an EIR, requiring, again, less time and therefore money. An AMP could also limit the possibility of preparing an EIR just for VMT impacts by either providing pre-approved and vetted options for VMT reduction features or selecting from a list of pre-approved projects to reduce regional VMT. Both of which could fully mitigate a potentially significant VMT impact within an MND instead of within an EIR. And this is a little bit similar to the Ventura County Air Pollution Control District's program for cumulative countywide air quality impacts, another regional impact. Then even better, if possible, if your project is exempt and you can prepare an NOE, there's no public review period while MNDs do have that, and overall require far less time and money to prepare. So to briefly touch on categorical exemptions again, those can be found under Article 19 of the CEQA guidelines. There are 32 classes, and the ones most relevant to housing and VMT include classes 3, 5, 26, and 32. Generally, I would recommend looking into a categorical exemption if your project is under 5 acres in an urban and infill setting or includes affordable housing units. And then it's important to note that a categorical exemption can only be triggered, can only be used if none of these exceptions listed are triggered, including location, cumulative impact, which does include cumulative VMT impacts, so a significant effect due to unusual circumstances, presence of scenic highways, hazardous waste sites, or historical resources. And then statutory exemptions, unlike categorical exemptions, apply almost regardless of environmental impacts and require minimal documentation, such as a feasibility study. These include ministerial projects, emergency projects, and financial assistance for low or moderate income housing. And these can be found under Article 18 of the CEQA guidelines. And then there's been some new legislation that was passed in the 2022 cycle and recently signed by Governor Newsom. These introduced some new big S streamlining options. First is AB 2011, which allows for ministerial approval for 100% affordable and also mixed income housing within commercial zones and corridors. There's also SB 6, which deems a housing project on an office, retail, or parking zone allowable under certain conditions. And this is open for streamlining under an existing exemption of SB 35, which streamlines approval for affordable multifamily projects. And then there's also SB 886, which allows for an exemption for student housing. So just to review process and documentation for exemptions, obviously the first thing a lead agency should do is determine that project's exemption status. If possible, target more than one exemption category to be ready to defend against possible challenges. Mention that the exemption categories in the NOE itself, along with any applicable staff reports. And then file your NOE, which helps to ensure dismissal of CEQA litigation brought by parties who failed to challenge the exemption before project approval and triggers a 35-day statute limitations for any other CEQA lawsuits. Next slide. So as I've alluded to throughout this presentation, before discussing these exemptions, even if an NOE is not a possibility and VMT is potentially a significant impact, a lead agency within VCOG or the region can avoid an EIR in favor of an MND using the AMP. First, to determine if VMT is a significant impact, you should use the screening criteria to screen out less than significant VMT scenarios. So Sean talked about this a little bit, but the Office of Planning and Research has guidance to do so. And some lead agencies have adopted their own criteria, including, I believe, Ventura County and the city of Camarillo. Office of Planning and Research guidance recommends screening out projects that meet one of a number of thresholds related to project size, location, transit availability, and affordability, which I believe will be touched on later in the workshop. And then if none of those screening criteria are met, this is kind of where the AMP comes in. The lead agency can use the AMP to mitigate VMT in an MND, which is the little s streamlining I've been referring to. This taps into a slate of pre-approved mitigation measures to regionally reduce VMT or with the project itself, instead of reinventing the wheel on a project-by-project basis. So just to briefly touch on tiering or big S streamlining, these options allow for tiering off of a previously certified EIR using a checklist instead of an initial study or another EIR. Under these options, you can't introduce new mitigation, but only use the mitigation from the document off which you are tiering. Therefore, if you do tier off a specific or general plan that had included the AMP as mitigation, you can use that same mitigation measure, if applicable, to prepare one of these checklists. So some of these include the 1920x1080 and 1920x1083 checklists, which are for projects within the scope of a program EIR, such as a general plan, or projects consistent with a plan or zoning that were adopted with certified EIR. There's another one, 1920x1083, that's related to infill projects, which do tend to have a lower VMT to begin with. There's a 1920x1082, which is for certain project types consistent with a specific plan for which an EIR was certified within a transit priority area, TPA. And these areas do tend to be within low VMT areas due to the other options for transportation and also surrounding goods and services. And then there's option to tier off a sustainable community strategy under SB 375 for mixed use residential projects within a TPA, or SB 226 for infill projects that also have features that reduce VMT. Go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so the general takeaway from this brief sequence discussion is that there are many options for a lead agency to streamline or exempt a project. These options generally open up for infill projects, projects that include affordable housing or mixed use projects. These types of projects often go hand in hand with VMT screening criteria from OPR or adopted by a lead agency, as they're either in low VMT zones to begin with or don't induce significant VMT. But when VMT does prove to be a barrier to exemption or big S streamlining, the adaptive mitigation program would be a great option to avoid preparation of an EIR that'll end up with a significant and unavoidable VMT impact only. Yep, so that's it for me. I'm happy to field any questions.
Same. Jesse, I'll get it started. Justin and I were talking while we were on mute. So in terms of a categorically exempt project, what's sort of that technical level of VMT analysis that would be needed to sort of demonstrate, or would it really not need VMT analysis? It's already exempt. We don't really even look at that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So if the project meets the series of conditions that I believe, if you go back to that slide, I might have it on there. And one of the conditions is, yeah, so cumulative impacts related to VMT. So if one of the cumulative impacts is VMT, then you couldn't prepare one of those categorical exemptions, and that's only for certain classes as well. It's kind of different for each class of categorical exemptions. And Rich, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I think you hit the key point there, Jesse, which is it depends on the class that you're using for the exemption. For certain exemptions, you do need to show that there's no unusual circumstances that would trigger an impact, and one of those circumstances could be VMT impact. So you would need at least some sort of quantitative analysis to qualify, provide the substantial evidence to demonstrate that you qualify for those exemption classes. And it's up to the lead agency to determine how far to go with that.
All right, we have a couple more questions here in the Q&A in the chat. Kathleen asked, how can you clarify how you were defining infill?
It's a good question. I'm really referring to the infill definition in the class 32 categorical exemption. And I'm not sure if there's an exact definition in the CEQA guidelines. Rich, do you know?
Yeah, it's in there. So, you know, needing to be surrounded on 3 sides by urban development, for example, you know, you can kind of take a look at the different qualifying factors. There's several for class 32. For other exemptions, including some of the statutory exemptions, when referring to infill, sometimes it's attaching transit priority areas to the definition. So it is important. It's a great question, because depending on the exemption being used, the definition of infill may be slightly different.
And the next question, will you be providing a copy of the presentation to the attendees? And yes, we will post it on the VCTC website for everyone, and then I can send the link out to everyone who was invited today. And another question in the chat. Do older CEQA approvals, like a specific plan from the 1990s, need VMT to process an amendment?
Yes, I believe they do for at Rincon for the projects we prepared addendums to documents that had used level of service as the transportation impact. We then need to go and analyze the project under SB 743 and analyze VMT to do an addendum or any type of streamlining.
Do we have any other questions or comments at this point? Any in the chat or the Q&A?
Another one just above. Might be something
It was from earlier. Regular updates to the VMT data will show area-wide VMT and height classes. I don't see any hands raised either, so we can go on to the next.
Great, moving right along. Thank you, Jesse. So our third of 4 topics is, you know, in the AMP, we sort of define some roles and recommendations for those roles. So, I think it's got to be, there we go. Okay, great. So, so we sort of defined 4 general roles. So lead agencies, of course, and the key takeaway there is just have a clear process for your proponents. For the project proponents or applicants, it's really about doing due diligence and incorporating VMT analysis early, so that you have an idea of what you need to address. And then for the countywide agencies, VCTC and VCOG, it's really to provide the technical tools that are used by the lead agency and sort of lighten that load upon them. And then for others, it's really to continue to participate in the process, especially in helping to define new types of mitigations. When we presented to the Transportation Commission at the end of sort of our first phase here, we had a good question from a commissioner about, well, could you even mitigate by supporting affordable housing directly? I think that is very possible. And so we don't want to cut off any sort of original types of mitigation. So for lead agencies, I think we crossed out our first one because they've sort of achieved that, which is really to line up housing elements along with concentrating and sort of supporting those statewide goals, which was pretty effectively done. The next is really to define VMT thresholds for CEQA review, or at least rely on the statewide guidelines, just make that clear. Of course, they have the discretion of setting thresholds that are specific to a project's unique conditions. We definitely are going to see that and don't want to say don't do that for very unique projects in unique locations. So it's interesting. A lot of these are sort of gentle recommendations. They're, for the most part, there'll be good standards to follow, but we understand that it's not a one size fits all. And then the last one for lead agencies is really try to define a set of multimodal infrastructure projects that are that could be partially funded as mitigation from development projects. It's a revenue stream that is inconsistent and probably wouldn't cover a full infrastructure project, but it's important to have that, I think, as an avenue for your project proponents to be able to mitigate their VMT impacts to less than significant. For project proponents, please review the VMT characteristics of your project site. At the beginning of the process, even back in the days when we did traffic operations, that was a smart thing to do. I've only been involved, I think, in 2 projects, which actually included off-site traffic elements as part of their project description. And they were totally correct when it got into an EIR, and it made things a lot easier. They were things that were conditions of opening just because they were project elements. They didn't have to fall under a mitigation program. The next thing is just to develop projects that sort of avoid VMT impacts. Really, obviously the land is not movable. If you own a parcel of land, you want to develop it, it's in a high VMT area, there's not much you can do about that, but you can work on making it more mixed use, or the mix of development that you look at, and then definitely take credit for any VMT reducing elements you have, and we'll talk about that within the next section. And then, include VMT reduction in early discussions with lead agencies, because the cities and the county will have good ideas about what are the best and feasible reducing elements. So for countywide agencies, really to continue to provide technical analysis, the travel demand model is the best quantitative source for VMT data. Some cities have their own model, and that is fine too. It's helpful actually to have multiple data sources in a way in order to sort of ensure that you're getting the best assessments for VMT. Definitely work to refine this program as a regional standard going forward. We're at the beginning of this evolution. It was 2020 that the new CEQA guidelines went into effect. And so there's a lot of best practices still to be had out there and to integrate into a program. REAP 2.0, which is a big revenue source for potential resources, really can be used to support lead agencies in accommodating all sorts, streamlining not only for transportation, I believe for other aspects of CEQA as well. And then while we didn't really include it in this program yet, it might be good to have some regional options for mitigation in a way for projects to pay into that. For the most part, lead agencies for a number of reasons are going to want to have mitigations within their jurisdiction, but it just may be possible that there's some more regional mitigations that make sense. And then finally for others, definitely work to develop new forms of mitigation. There's really no harm in having VMT reduction strategies. Another thing through the development of this program we talked about was funding for transit and transit operations, which isn't commonly used. Mostly it's people like to lend on the side for mitigation to be on capital expenses because they're easily tracked. But there's really nothing preventing participation in dealing with operations, because we get a lot of feedback from transit agencies that they don't really have as much a capital problem as an operating budget problem. And so if that's holding back people from using transit, there's no reason why support in that sense, like for instance, buying transit passes for developments and making them available for tenants, wouldn't be much more effective than improving the bus stop, which is a fairly passive mitigation, as opposed to transit passes, which is sort of getting to the heart of improving transit ridership. And yeah, just continue to participate in the process, and whatever next steps come. So that was a short section, but are there any questions about that? Those items. We're hoping not to make it homework for people, but we just in general want to demonstrate that everyone has a role in this process. We'll move right into the next section if there isn't too many questions. And again, we're always available if you have questions after this fact and how. We're really looking forward to having comments back on the process and anywhere where we can continue to provide help. So the next section is a little bit more of a walking through examples of hopefully proactive, and in some cases not necessarily proactive, identification of VMT impacts. So this is where we're talking about a more standard methodology for VMT analysis, hopefully fairly simple, that's available to lead agencies and project proponents. It certainly is an exercise that can be done prior to a CEQA process. It's very helpful to know where you stand prior to entering the CEQA process, and if not for anything else, to understand how to reduce cost and time in how you are addressing VMT impacts. So it is 4 steps. We try to make it simple, but in general, VMT assessment can be broken down to 4 steps. You've got project screening. These meet statutory screening, such as it's too small of a project, it's affordable housing, it's in a transit area. There are a couple of other screenings. There's certainly screening that can be done, or screening criteria that can be developed by lead agencies. The next step would be a preliminary VMT assessment. So that's really based on the project location, and you'll get sort of what I'd call a top line VMT value for a development, and that's based off of what's in that area right now. So for housing, it would be the average VMT for housing in the area currently, because geography plays and the transportation network plays such a huge role in what the VMT is. We can get a pretty good idea of what the project would be by its neighbors. The next level would be that CEQA VMT determination. So that's comparing that step number 2 to the lead agency's threshold. And that's why it's important for the lead agencies to be clear about the threshold, because it means that people who haven't gone down that CEQA full analysis track certainly can then take a look-see and know where they are. And then mitigation is that last step. That would only be applied if a project was above a CEQA threshold. So the primary tool for VMT assessment is the county's travel demand model. Likewise, some lead agencies have their own travel demand model. That would be the standard for them. All of these models are, and they do call this children of a parent model, which is the Southern California Association of Governments, the SCAG regional travel demand model, which is developed when they do their regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategy. And when Jesse was talking, there's essentially a mechanism for tiering off of a sustainable community strategy. So these are all sort of part of that same continuum of understanding how land use and transportation interact. These models are directly made from that overall process. So there's a high degree of substantial evidence and practicality in using them. One thing it does do is it does the VMT at a traffic analysis zone. This is a geography that's probably more aligned with census tracts than with parcels. So, you know, a project's generally within a census tract, it's not going to take up the whole thing. So its characteristics are mostly like its neighbors, but there may be some unique differences. So that geography is for many reasons been maintained. So that's just the level of geography that we deal with on that travel demand model level. It's pretty easy with that output to index to residential VMT and employment VMT. We just have to be careful of the VMT that we're looking at. Essentially, you want to match the vehicle miles traveled estimated from a development with the people living there. So the VMT that comes out of this model, we're going to call it a top line VMT value that would be used for an individual project, meaning it's the sort of that standard basic VMT at the project level, understanding there may be some unique conditions of a project site. So this is actually that same map brought in that we used earlier, that's more parcel based and bringing in protected areas, high quality transit areas, low VMT areas. And currently Drew here at VCTC is developing a new map, web map that looks like that, which is parcel level. So what that means is it's taking that traffic analysis zone map and it's putting it onto the parcels and allowing an applicant or a lead agency to look up their individual parcel site and see what their VMT situation is. And I think we're going to have sort of a lookup thing. You can look up by the APN number too, because this is essentially a spreadsheet of all those APN numbers for the parcel. So it's a quick way of understanding where you lay in the VMT realm before you even get started. So taking those 4 steps on the left that I said earlier, screening, a preliminary assessment, CEQA, and then mitigation, we have 5 scenarios we're going to sort of walk through. And they're in increasing difficulty to mitigate, increasing difficulty, increasing VMT, that kind of thing. So an affordable housing development, 100% will be the first one. Development low VMT area, high VMT area, higher and the highest VMT areas. People don't want to talk about the highest ones generally, but we're gonna tackle that one. So so in all scenarios, just to have a common thread, they're all they'll just be a large project. So they're not going to screen because they're a single house being developed. And in it, the lead agency VMT threshold is 20 VMT per capita, and the city average is 20 VMT per capita. So the CEQA threshold is 17 VMT per capita. These are not actual VMT projects or VMT values. We're just sort of simplifying it for this, which is important because I used a map and it's focused on Camarillo, and so it's not specific to it. So our first case study is affordable housing development. Mostly that's provided as being screened out because of its category. So it's presumed less than significant. And that's really a qualitative assessment of VMT would be performed for that. So the second one is a housing development in a low VMT area, so that light green. So in this case, the lead agency threshold is 17 VMT per capita. But when you look at the model, your VMT, even just your top line, the generically being in that zone is 16 VMT per capita. So you're below that. So, you know, it doesn't meet the screening criteria. But when you do your sort of preliminary assessment, it's 16. So that comes out of the travel demand model. And the city's CEQA threshold there, 85% of the average is 17. So, you know, that's sort of, it's a qualitative assessment using those values. You don't have to do additional calculations. You're just sort of demonstrating. We are below the city's threshold because of where the project's located, and that's what we expect the project's VMT to be. So as Jesse and Richard were saying, even when you have a categorical exemption, if you're, you know, thinking it might be a cumulative impact, you could use this kind of preliminary assessment to be the documentation of demonstrating that you are below that threshold. So number 3, we're moving a little bit out from the city center. It's a higher VMT area. So again, the threshold 17 VMT per capita. The top line VMT for the project is 18.9. It's a little bit higher. So just sort of skipping here, that's your top line value is above your CEQA threshold there. So that means you got to do a little more work. So getting all the way a callback all the way to the beginning of those statewide goals, really we're about you know, balancing the infill development and promoting multimodal transportation that really has health benefits and reducing greenhouse gases. So this leads into, you can do project elements that reduce vehicle trips. And so that would be, you know, the mix of land use on the site, the infrastructure, travel demand management options, and then even some offsite fair share contributions. So this is the point of the project where an applicant could consider doing these as part of the project. And so in this case, you know, the generically 10% reduction from some of those elements then bring your project down below. And so, you know, this is a simplified version, but essentially, if you create a project, and definitely try to take the credit for doing so, that has VMT reducing elements, then it may be that you're below that CEQA threshold with those project elements. So that top line VMT value isn't sort of the end of the story. You can bring in project elements that are unique to the project that would bring it within the CEQA threshold. So you know, that's really about the proactive project elements. This is more of a, you know, mitigated negative declaration or even EIR type level situation. So it is more qualitative, but you're addressing those elements outside of a mitigation program. So moving out farther, a housing development in a higher VMT area. So, you know, now it's at 20.7. So skipping ahead, you're doing those on-site elements, you're still exceeding that threshold. And so, you know, you need to get into mitigations, project mitigations, and applying mitigations to the project to get it down to be presumed or to be less than significant impact. And then, of course, the dreaded highest VMT area. Some parts of the county, of course, have just very high VMT due to their geography and distance from transportation services. So you go all the way down, and you still, you know, you've done all feasible mitigations. You're still not below the threshold. So that's getting into an area of statement of overriding considerations, which, you know, it's after all feasible mitigations have been exhausted. So that may in fact be a situation, hopefully minimized through the program, but it is, and it is possible. To round up, I think that the key here is really to understand VMT, the VMT of a project early, and that is to include project elements if you need them to reduce VMT, and make sure you account for those and take credit for those, but that they're also mitigation options available. Any questions? So we already have a question from Kathy. Affordable housing projects may be screened out without VMT analysis. That is possible. That is actually up to the lead agency. For the most part, 100% affordable housing projects generally can be presumed to be less than significant. There are some caveats there that it may be that they're not presumed to be less than significant because of their location. But the statewide guidance has some substantial evidence in there about VMT from affordable housing being lower than market rate housing. And sort of that's indicating that they would then be presumed to be less than what's there. But I could definitely see where if a lead agency had concerns about where affordable housing was going in, that VMT may still be something that they would require, but that, you know, it's certainly, I guess, in that case, up to the lead agency to make that judgment. Yeah, Mark really wants to discuss, you know, really that good faith effort to reduce VMT, even if that statement of overriding considerations is approved. And, you know, that, and Jesse, correct me if I'm wrong, and Richard, you know, that statement of overriding consideration is really after feasible mitigations have been exhausted. So they need to have attempted in good faith to exhaust their options. That's probably another aspect of this program where there's a mechanism for a fair share cost participation to reduce VMT. That is very possible that wouldn't actually, you know, there would almost always be an option for mitigation, but I'm sure that there's at some point an exhaustion level, and that could be statement of overriding consideration could still be used if they've exhausted all of their potential for mitigation.
And Kathleen has asked, how can you outline how VCTC's VMT program would work with the city's VMT CEQA guidelines and city established VMT process?
Yeah, I think that it is constructed in a way to be supportive of lead agencies, CEQA guidelines, and their VMT processes. So in cases where a city has gone ahead and defined thresholds and has a process for analysis, that is great. The only thing that the program is really providing in that case is information and support in that. A lot of communities, though, don't have mature, don't have their own CEQA guidelines or have defined them much more than a threshold. And so it's really meant to help those communities as well that may need to have sort of a more substantial process themselves. Okay, so question is the payment of fees for future infrastructure, so bike and transit. So fees towards multimodal transportation projects that we know to reduce VMT. Is that acceptable as VMT mitigation, and how are these fees collected? The answer is yes. So that is what that concept of that fair share cost participation is. There are a couple of challenges there in terms of mitigation. If it's mitigation, there's an additionality requirement that those funds, the mitigation funds are not intended to supplant previously committed funding. So one thing mitigation can't do is come in and pay for something that's already, say, got a grant. And that would be considered additional. It wouldn't be permissible as mitigation. But one thing we're doing the AMB is sort of drawing that line of what is an additional mitigation. And that line generally is, if it's in the city's capital improvement program, but it does not, it just says, oh, it's funded generally by future general fund or future grants. Sometimes communities include that. That is not additional. It would only be in cases where you have committed and sort of signed funding to a project. So yes, that fair share cost amount that could be collected from an applicant. So you're a city, you impose a mitigation, you apply a fair share, it comes out to be, X number of dollars. That would be that financial requirement would be required as part of approving the EIR and put into a mitigation program. So question is, are local transit providers partnering with local agencies to help address VMT? I think the answer is always. That's, in a sense, their goals of providing access and riders, non-single occupancy vehicle option for mobility is exactly their core purpose. So definitely, I think they partner in the sense that they are providing that transit service. I think that next level of partnership is really working to help develop in ways that is supporting those transit services where they already are, so that the transit agencies don't have to be stretched thinner to offer their services. We're already seeing that at Oxnard with some development that Gold Coast Transit sort of partnered with, and I think there was affordable housing even. So yes, I think as we move to the future, we're going to have more and more partnerships between the transit providers and lead agencies as they plan their systems. So, a very good question from the chat from Jasmine. How frequently should we expect the VMT maps or thresholds to be updated? Okay, so Drew's a good one to ask this, but I'll start it out. So the regional travel demand model is updated every 4 years. And then it takes probably about a year or so for those updates to work its way to the next level of models. So it's probably every 4 years. It's sort of like an Olympic schedule of updates. And that's fine. I mean, if you think most development is already in place. So I forget what it is, 95% of the housing in the county isn't going to change into the future as we move into the future, as those RENA allocations are built out. And so a lot of that foundational VMT, it does not change a whole lot over time. Another aspect of that is because VMT per capita is a relative measure. So you're comparing your score versus the city's average. Those two things are moving in concert for the most part. So even if there are differences among every model, basically, and but the thing that probably doesn't change is that ratio of an individual project to the city average. So these things will change every 4 years about, but that relationship of comparing the thresholds shouldn't change too much. Much like when we looked at the old traffic operations, as everyone will attest, except for during the pandemic, traffic sort of constantly grows, and so we always had this moving target of analysis. And so this is a little bit of the same way, same thing. You had a follow-up question about VMT per capita dependent on census population data. Yes, that's one of the data underpinnings of it. So it is that population, that's the people. And then their transportation activity is actually the thing that probably changed a little more over time. As Amanda presented in the beginning, a lot more people working from home. So that affects it. New transit services affects it. VMT tends to be a very complicated measure. when you're looking into what is affecting it. But for the most part, in the county and within the communities, it's sort of moving together. So I think that's the really long answer. The short answer is 4 years. And I think that is something that has maybe not been so important in the past, and maybe now needs to be more announced to communities. Okay, we have this update of travel demand model data that's available to you.
So for us, for City of Simi Valley, it'd probably be dependent upon whenever we do a general plan update, or maybe individually.
Yeah, so cities that have their own model generally tie that with the general plan update, just because that's the land use change, right? But that, in theory, should be valid for that whole period, because you've made your land use decisions, and unless which hopefully no one's doing, you're radically developing differently than your general plan. That's when you'd have problems. But for the most part, it's predicated on projecting a future that you're envisioning. So
Every 7 years with the housing element update.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's not exactly the VMT that's coming from the site. We're using the best information we can in sort of the most feasible way of doing this kind of analysis. And it's been common practice before VMT was included. We used to do, essentially trip generation rates from a site. Those are fairly inflated numbers. And everyone knows that in the transportation field, it's pretty conservative, and conservative wasn't a bad thing, because that was, we're making sure that our communities have adequate public facilities, and it's, there's no harm in being conservative with how we project. So we're projecting maximum conditions for every site. Well, housing's not 100% occupied all the time. All of these things are generally a little bit lower than we normally would think. And so there is a little, say, understanding that these are estimates, or best estimates, and they're not perfect, but we have in this county, a sustained effort to continually update this VMT information, which is good. And I think that's what's necessary to have the underpinnings of this data that's available to the lead agencies and applicants. I think
I'm curious, Drew and I were sort of talking here a minute ago about how does one calculate a fair share assessment? Normally we would do that based on trips, but in this case it would be VMT.
Sure.
Potentially, would that just be the aggregate VMT of the project, not dividing per capita?
Yeah. It's interesting. It is sort of, again, by per trip. So you can sort of work to get to a VMT per capita. You need to know the people, the number of trips they're making, and the distance they're going. So you take those pieces and you have an aggregate VMT. That's the easiest way to do it. And then you have the citywide average that you apply to those people and make sort of a goal aggregate VMT. And then you apply mitigation measures, which generally are a % reduction in its simplest sense, and keep applying those until you're below the threshold. So we didn't detail that here. We detail a little more in the report. The state of the practice has gone a little more like, maybe percentage isn't perfect, especially if you're applying multiple mitigations. There's sometimes you're just continually hitting the same subset of your residents. Bike racks and bike lanes, and those are the bicyclists. That you can't take full credit for that. So there's some methods for sort of diminishing or tempering down the effectiveness of those mitigations. So you're not really overstating. I think the concern, you don't want to overstate it. And furthermore, there's a little bit of an acknowledgement too about the scale of development. That's what's effective at what scale of development. So in a way, it becomes a little bit more complicated, but I think for most, especially housing projects, they're in a certain area where lead agencies would be best to decide what they want what mitigations they want to see out of their applicants and have that available to them, because those are going to be the most effective. You know, it's because it's supportive of what the community is already doing. So by far the most effective mitigations are the ones that support what the community is already investing in. So if you have an extensive bike network, bike parking is way more effective than that than if you were to just stick bike parking out in an area that does not have more sophisticated bike infrastructure. So I think beyond the quantitative analysis that go in, just that qualitative idea of supporting the city's broader goals is probably the most important thing.
Do we have any other questions or comments at this point? We think we've gotten through the ones that we can see here.
Okay, I think we're,
Oh, gosh, we have almost reached the end here. So the next steps in this process will be essentially to sort of test this methodology and the use of the tools that this program has developed, and to share the website information with all of you. We would greatly appreciate your review and any feedback or comments that you have on the draft report. And we will be posting that draft report to the website, and we'll also send it out to everyone who is invited and participated today in the workshop. Once we have received the comments from the public and agencies, we will prepare a final version of the report and all the tools, and then bring that to our commission, the Ventura County Transportation Commission, for acceptance or adoption sometime in the spring of 2023. So we haven't exactly set the date yet for the adoption, but we'll be sure to let all of you know when that program comes to our commission for final review. And we should probably talk about grant deadlines as well to make sure we're meeting that. But we'll be sure to notify everyone when that time comes for any additional input or feedback that you would like to share with us. So with that, is that the last?
that is the last. We just have a thank you slide.
So thank you so much for sticking with us all this time. I know that this is a meaty topic that can be a little, it's a lot to wrap your brain around. So thank you all for being here with us today. If you would like to reach out to me, my email is provided in the slides. It's afagan@goventura.org. And I'd be happy to facilitate any getting answers for any additional questions or comments that you may have. So again, thank you so much for your time and inputs. Looks like we do have one maybe note in the chat. Oh, so thank you. Great. All right. So unless there are any other questions or comments, we will be signing out. And again, thank you for your time and participation. All right. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.